Well, thanks for coming, everyone. I'm Joan McGregor. This talk today is being sponsored by the Lincoln Center for Applied Ethics. And I'm the new director of the center. If you don't know about us, get to know us, some of our events. And but we're really delighted to have this program today. We've got two amazing speakers. If you don't know about AI, you will soon. Those of us who are teachers, we're besieged with the worries of what AI is going to do for our classes. So that's the downside of AI that we see. But anyway, it's all around. Of course, ASU is big in AI, and one of the areas in which AI is being promoted and talked quite a bit about is in medicine, right? And in fact, if you're not aware, we are starting a new medical school here at ASU. It'll open in a couple of years. And some of us, and this is where this talk kind of was generated, Fox and I are part of a team of people from Medical Humanities trying to integrate from the get-go the humanistic content, bioethics, and other aspects of the humanities into the curriculum. This medical school is going to have specific attention to AI and in medicine. So we'll be one of a few medical schools, although Alex today was telling me that Emory also has this. I guess we're not alone. But anyway, it is one of the things that's really coming down the pike. And so the question is what as people think about the ethics of stuff, we wanted to think about what are the ethical issues around the use of AI in medicine. And so that was sort of the genesis of this talk today. And so we've got I want to introduce our speakers here today. We are really delighted to have Alexander Tolbert, who is currently an assistant professor he's actually in the Department of Quantitative Theory and Methods. He's also a philosopher, and philosophers like to stay together because we're a certain kind of tribe. So we'll make him, he's an honorary, he is a philosopher. But he's also a principal investigator of the Tolbert Black Digital Studies Lab and a co-principal investigator of AI and Philosophy Lab with Emily Ruth Diana. He's got a PhD from University of Pennsylvania and currently earned a master's in statistics at the Woods institution. So we're really excited to have him. He's doing really super interesting work, and he's going to be our speaker today. And then we have our new colleague here on the philosophy faculty, Ian Peebles, who is, just a new faculty member here who works in bioethics, works on philosophy of race, and also works in the AI space as well. So he's going to be a respondent to the paper, and then we'll have another kind of comments, and then we'll open it up to questions. So again, thank you all for joining us, and thank you to those who are online watching. So, turn it over.
Awesome. Thanks for having me. So like my research is sort of at the intersection of doing a lot of math stuff, proving stuff mathematically about algorithms and certain fairness guarantees, and this, sort of separate line of research that's sort of more philosophy, science, normative work, broadly construed. And so the talk I'm going to talk about today is like a paper I've been working on, and say a little bit about the structure of it. It's titled "Should AI Be Your Doctor?" So it's kind of give the structure of what I'm talking about. So basically, the first part of the talk is kind of like surveying different types of common objections or worries people have to AI as a primary healthcare provider. After that, I'll sort of maybe say a bit about why those responses, why some of them may not be as strong as you might think they are. And then I'll maybe say about maybe motivate some conditions whereby it might. That's more or less the sort of roadmap here. So so that has been an AI and called huge transformative transformations in various sectors of healthcare. Recently it's been applied in lots of different areas, radiology, pathology, other screening tools, and it's shown a huge potential for enhancing diagnostic precision, personalization of treatment regimens, and even optimizing operational efficiency. So for instance, like AI driven imaging analysis is shown superior accuracy in detecting anomalies such as tumors compared to other traditional methods. So at the same time, large natural language model technologies facilitate extracting meaningful insights from unstructured medical records. So this sort of enhances the comprehensiveness of patient histories and inform more tailored approaches to medical treatment. And even beyond the clinical diagnosis, AI has been integrated into lots of administrative functions. So addressing efficiency that play in healthcare institutions like inventory management, billing, coding, patient rooming can be optimized with. So for the hospitals often waste essential resources on inefficient processes, diverting critical resources from patients in care. And AI can automate repetitive tasks and ensure accuracy in billing, coding, optimize patient workflow, manage inventory and different types of with predictive analytics. So there's this increasing integration of AI sort of like in the healthcare sector. And yeah, so by reducing administrative burden, AI more or less streamlines operations and reallocates resources to direct patient care. But despite these advances, there's been a few sort of criticisms that have emerged. And I'm going to talk about a few of them. One of them is sort of like epistemic limitations. Other, what I'm going to call like broad sort of episodic care criticisms. Another one sort of like normative criticism, and others sort of like around like pragmatic concerns. So the first one is sort of epistemic. So like AI, the critics argue that AI might perpetuate bias, so like a lack of touch for effective caregiving, loss, yes. Okay, here. So yeah, so now I'm going to go through sort of this epistemic objection. So epistemic objections refer to limitations in AI's ability to generate accurate, reliable, adaptive knowledge, particularly in medical context. So I'm going to broadly categorize these into two types of objections. One's related to the data on which the AI is trained, and then the other one's concerned about like the AI or the algorithm itself. So let me be super clear about this because this is conflated a lot. So like, so when you're talking about like algorithm, that's sort of like a set of mathematical procedures or rules that produces a model, right? And and that algorithm is trained on some data. So you train an algorithm that's like a set of instructions. You know, it might be something like empirical risk minimization or something like that. That's going to output a statistical model, and then people use that statistical model to basically inform some decision. Okay, so that's the point of that distinction. So you could have an issue about like the nature of the data on which the algorithm that people are referred to as AI is trained, or you could just think the sort of like algorithm itself. So oh, it's just only optimizing for like accuracy and not like something like equalizing false positives and false negatives. So some explicit fairness is in arrive that you might want to also encapsulate. So that may be another type of criticism. So first on the first category, I'm going to refer to these as like data integrity, epistemic issues. So like you know, so they can so several causes can undermine data integrity. So like variant in group wise accuracy or error rate. So like just kind of give an intuitive. So if you don't know anything about machine learning, how it works is a very simple, intuitive way to understand it. Let's say I've never tasted papaya before a day in my life. I want to know whether or not a papaya is tasty or not. If I want to do some naive machine learning, what I would do is like maybe bring to you a basket of papayas that have already been tasted and they have like a label on them that says tasty and not tasty. Okay. And maybe based on something like the hardness and color of these papayas, if I give you like 1,000 of these papayas, you know, after you've seen, you know, 1,000 papayas, I might give you a basket of unlabeled papayas. So they have no label on them. And if you're a good learner, because you've seen thousands of labeled papayas that already had this little tag on them, you should make very few mistakes, right? That's basically a very simple, intuitive way for how a lot of machine learning works. And I was kind of running a little algorithm implicitly in the background right there. Basically doing what's called empirical risk minimization, making as few mistakes as possible on the training data, which was that label data of papayas. Okay, now you say, well, fair enough. But let's say I ratcheted up this thought experiment for a second. Now imagine the papayas are not just from one group. Imagine there's like two groups of papayas. papayas from Arizona and papayas from Georgia. Now, papayas don't grow in either one of these places. So again, it's a velocity thought experiment, so it doesn't need to have a certain level of accuracy. Again, just but there's two papayas, okay? Two papayas are from these two groups. But let's just keep some stuff constant, okay? So I still give you 1,000 of them, so still enough to be fairly accurate. But now, let's say that I only give you 10 papayas from Georgia, and I give you 990 from Arizona. And I tell you to do the same thing, make as few mistakes as you can overall. Okay, would you do well? Yes, you would do well, because overall you still need 1,000 papayas. So you would make very few mistakes on the unlabeled data of papayas I give you, overall. Now, if I ask you how well you do on subset of the feature space, well, you would probably do really poorly on these papayas from Georgia. You only seen 10 of them, and especially if the papayas grow in different conditions, which, humid. Again, I don't know anything about how papayas grow, but it's dry out here, it's humid. A tasty papaya in Georgia might look really different from a tasty papaya in Phoenix. Now, in real life, it's not papayas that is the problem here. It's a successful candidate for college admissions that's from a low-income community looks really different from a successful candidate from a high-income community. The person can just take the SAT over and over and over again, And so focusing on group-wise error rates, like people, that's why people will care about that. Because in the first case, I was only concerned with the objective function was just on accuracy overall. Does the model perform overall with it? Yes. But that's not good enough. We also have certain concerns about subgroups of the feature space that may correspond to some relevant social demographic, right? So if it's something like medical diagnosis where it's like, oh, like, is it a tumor in this image? Is it a tumor not in this image? And that leads to like me either getting a surgery that I shouldn't have, or you misdiagnosing my cancer, that seems like a problem. So disparity in error rates is a problem when it's nothing about so we want to be careful here. We don't make a conceptual error between like a statistical property of the model, which is just like error rates. It's some normative thing. It has to be that the statistical error rate corresponds to some salient normative thing you care about. Where in this case, it's like the false positive, false negative of the tumor thing corresponds to either getting the surgery or not getting the surgery. That's what you care about. In the case of something like let's say I have an algorithm that is designed to recommend books or something like this. And let's say it performs consistently wrong on people who are born on a leap year. And so I have few data on people who are born on leap years, same sort of thing. It's a type that's underrepresentational bias that I just described, where fewer examples from some group show up in the training set that the algorithm is built on. I have fewer data from people born on leap years, so the algorithm consistently does poorly on people with leap years. But let's say it doesn't make a difference in your book recommendation. I still get the books I want. It doesn't really matter. It's not really a consequential thing for my self-development and a society. It is not really clear that that's either a harm or that it leads to an injustice. So just because you have group-wise error rates doesn't really, again, that's just a statistical property of a model. But the data integrity criticism is supposed to be pointing this out, like, data is biased in various ways. Well, let's be very clear, the way it's biased here, fewer qualified candidates show up in your training set. There could be lots of reasons for that. Just to give one example, if I'm a qualified Black candidate, I know a job's racist, I want to apply. Right? So that means, more qualified Black people who could have been in the training set to train your algorithm on to what a good candidate for this job looks like don't show up, right? So the algorithm has a type of underrepresentation bias because of the causal mechanism that just filters out qualified candidates. Or it could be like in the case of medicine, fewer women apply to medical school, because of all types of norms around women should be at the house, saying maybe it should be nursing, less like burdens on you, so you can be freed up to do more domestic things or whatever. So women kind of historically not been really encouraged to apply to medical school. So like, even though this woman could have been perfectly qualified to be a medical school candidate, she didn't apply, so she don't show up in the training set. So that's like a type of underrepresentational bias that influences the data. The algorithm's trained on that data. And so unless you correct for that, the algorithm's going to be biased. So I'm just like kind of motivating when I'm talking about it, basically. So just, because it's just like this slide, it's like, okay, what does that even mean? So now you know what it means. So, and just to point out, there's lots of different ways you can have bias. I'm just focusing on one for the sake of brevity here. You know, like you can have label flipping bias. An example of that would be something like, there was a study done in 2004 by some economists that showed if you had an ethnic sounding name, your label will be positive, meaning that I would be a qualified candidate, but you know, it gets flipped to negative. So the decision maker says I'm not qualified. And that gets introduced in the training set. So in the first case with underrepresentational bias, fewer positive examples show up in the data set. In this case, it's not that fewer positive examples show up, it's more negative examples show up in certain groups because the label gets flipped to negative. That is a different type of bias. And you can't conflate them because there's different ways you can correct for them. Just to plug my own paper, got a paper online about how you correct over those types of biases, can read that. So, you know, how you can fix that. So various bias mitigation techniques oftentimes get employed, but this is one criticism people might have of AI in it, right? Type of data integrity. Okay, I'm not going to go through this. I just went through this, you know, more or less. So variation in error rate can lead to discrepancies in the AI models, unequal outcomes, you know, basically influence downstream decision makers. And basically you kind of put disproportionate burdens on marginalized populations, right? Because of it. So for example, an AI diagnostic tool trained predominantly on data from one demographic may perform poorly when applied to underrepresented populations, leading to diagnostic inaccuracies, disparities in treatment recommendations. That's more or less the type of criticism. Why you may not want to use AI. Here's a quote. Privilege bias occurs when certain populations can't access AI-driven healthcare when these algorithms require technology or sensors not universally available. This can lead to unequal distribution of AI healthcare benefits, exacerbating healthcare disparities or whatever. Another version of this, underrepresentation of epistemic just occurs when AI struggles with rare atypical cases that fall outside some pattern. So again, because a lot the way like machine learning broadly works like inductively, it's like it needs to see lots of examples, right? So if, you know, I work in a lot of theoretical machine learning. So if you look at this paper I just described, I do what's called uniform convergence proofs. Those proofs is like, it's just like, oh, if you have sufficient sample size, you know, I can bound my error within like this epsilon or whatever. Like that requires a lot of samples to do that, right? And so like anytime you don't have a lot of samples, like, you know, those sort of theoretical mathematical conditions aren't satisfied. So this type of thing says, well, you know, AI, anytime you don't have like, you know, you have like individuals that, you know, you don't have enough samples on them, like it's obviously not going to do it. You haven't seen lots of examples. So insufficient data representation. And that could just be not because of some sort of like malpractice or societal, you know, people being bad actors in society. It's just like it could be like a very peculiar case. You know, we haven't seen many of those before. You know, yes.
So thinking of women and heart disease. So for generations, the studies were all men. They didn't use women to do studies of symptoms of heart disease and all different aspects. And consequently, when someone did have a heart attack, a woman was dead a lot faster than a man because they didn't know, take records of women's symptoms differently. So you're saying now in AI, do they start all over to get their input, or do they use studies that were made before when they try to get their data, the algorithms? Do you know that?
Yeah. So they I mean, like when you train a machine learning algorithm, you're going to use data that's, you know, available to you to train the algorithm. You know, in a lot of these cases, they just may not have data on like certain populations, you know, and so like the sort of differences you make are going to be poor. That's sort of the thing I made here. Thanks for that question. So like, you know, if people do have clarificatory questions, it's not like some question about like objecting. I'm happy to answer that. That's fine. Like, I mean, because then I took this to be like actually clarifying this thing or whatever.
I'm just talking about methodology, not asking you to comment on.
No, I think this is a very helpful question. And no, yeah, so like the methodology is yes, like people are trying to get data. I mean, that's how you train an algorithm. Like you try to get as much data as you can, and the algorithm's going to perform based on how much data you can. And there's different, I don't want to for the talk, but I'm gonna talk about like why this objection, I'm gonna say why this objection is like kind of weak. Like, I mean, like this is, like, I mean, like, yes, this is an objection, but it's not even unique to AI, and there's lots of different things you can do to try to get around it. It's not something special about AI that, you know, is obvious to me like a real burden for like deploying these systems or whatever. Any more than it would be a burden for any inductive system. This is a general inductive problem to me. Again, not to play my hand, but just to answer this directly. Okay, so anyway, keep going here, just for the sake of time. So, yeah, so predictive model perform better with large data sets, you know, more or less what we're talking about. Each individual has a unique features of combination, making it challenging to generate highly predictive predictions solely based on traits. So to prove accuracy is necessary to group individuals in the reference classes. So what I'm saying here is, so what do people do around this? Now, again, this is a general problem in philosophy science. It's called a problem of individual probabilities. I want to predict the Ravens are going to win the Super Bowl next year. Well, okay, the Ravens have the team they have now. You can't really do that. Or like, what's the probability that you will recidivate? Well, there's only one in, you know. So like individual probabilities are like fundamentally unknowable, but we like literally reason like this all the time. And so what do people do? Well, what I'll do is I'll pick a reference class that you belong to, like black, and I just take an average over that reference class, basically. And well, there's lots of black people. There's only one Alex, but for some of there's lots of black people. I just take an average over black people, and then boom, that's your probability that you know you're gonna go back to jail. Or but also I'm 6'8", so you could pick that reference class. Oh, what's the probability that 6'8" people are gonna go to jail or whatever? You average, and the problem the reference class sounds like each one of those obviously reference classes has a different like probability, right? And there's no principal way to actually can say which is the salient or germane reference class you should be picking over. Again, just so plug, I have a paper on how you solve that problem called Reconciling Individual Probabilities. That's published online. You can read that. I have an algorithm for how you fix that. So again, you can already see how my talk is starting to go. All these objections, I think more or less, there's some careful algorithm, there's some clever algorithm that can be used to solve them. So anyway, yeah, so people think that this is a criticism. Okay. Yeah, so by averaging over reference classes, the model can improve its prediction. However, this introduces the reference class problem. Like there's no way to determine the most appropriate reference classes. So choices age, medical history are not straightforward. I mean, it is done so much in practice, you know, it's just fairly arbitrary, honestly. You know, it seems relevant. Who knows if you pick some group variable? I don't know, it seems reasonable, you know. So at any rate, the other one is intuitive knowledge objection. Oh, so these focuses on AI's lack of common sense or intuitive reasoning, so tacit knowledge, experimental learning to make judgments, so grasping contextual nuances or sort of like naturally, intuitively. So medical decision making supposedly requires interpret complex information, so patient history, lifestyle factors, subtle symptom. And so these contexts often depend on a lot of intuitive knowledge where AI doesn't have this type of adaptability, so it's claimed in sort of dynamic clinical environments. So AI's reliance on this sort of like pattern recognition that I was talking about earlier sort of fails to capture these subtleties, and it sort of, you know, leads to errors, like similar to the reference class problem. So patients presenting with a rare combination of symptoms might not fit an established pattern, causing AI to look critical aspects of a diagnosis. So again, we're still on the epistemic objection. These are types of epistemic words, just to kind of remind you what we're talking about here. Another one is like AI's ability to understand or grasp the medical conditions and the severity or even minor issues. So some critics argue that the inability of AI to truly understand this limits its role as an effective tool in medical decision making. Another one is sort of the black box objection. So I want to call this like the lucidness objection. Like, oh, AI is black box, you know what's going on in there. Like, you know, you got these millions of parameters, who knows, can't really explain it. Yeah, so AI challenges, you know, really finding a rationale behind the recommendations AI is doing, etc. Again, just for the sake of time, I'm going to skip through. Oh, and the last one here is adaptability. I call this adaptability. That like, oh, AI because of like this theoretical machine learning stuff I was talking about, assume certain things like the data is drawn IID, meaning it's drawn from the same distribution. You don't really have a lot of causal knowledge in the AI, so it doesn't really have the ability to transfer learn. I was surprised to see lots of these little robot cars driving around out here. We don't have any of those in Georgia, thank God for now. I don't know how they worked out the kinks of this because I don't work in this particular area. I'm more of a theorist, like doing math and stuff. But I mean, I don't know how they. One of the big problems is transfer learning. It's like, okay, well, I trained it on this data, but it's deployed in this other data, and like, how does it? I mean, same problems out here, y'all. And so yeah, that's that type of objection, that AI doesn't have the right type of causal knowledge to be transfer learning. Okay, so try to speed up here. So effective attitude objection. These more or less sound like AI doesn't have emotions. Okay? So at least not in any sense that we think makes sense. So therapeutic relationships, between patient provider foundation, involve trust, adherence to patient plans, overall satisfaction. So Chris argues like AI lacking consciousness and emotion can genuinely empathize with his patient. So, empathy supposedly is a cornerstone of medical practice, and it remains unclear whether AI can replicate this essential human trait. So that's another concern. So the impersonal nature of AI interactions risks diminishing the sense of connection between patient and healthcare providers. So this may impact patient satisfaction, adherence to treatment plans. Patients value emotional support, understanding that is claimed that human practitioners can provide. And so again, this other sort of things like one care-based objection highlights AI in intuitive reason understanding, especially in patient communication. So subtle cues like body language, this sort of thing, you can't really pick up on it. So it's kind of like I said, this sort of intuitive knowledge thing, this sort of objection, but it can't really pick up on subtle human emotional states or whatever, because it itself doesn't have effective attitude. So how could it possibly? That sort of that. So you can have miscommunication, misunderstandings, lack of personalized care. So for example, a patient expressing anxiety through their voice may require compassionate response to AI system. So again, just for the sake of brevity here, let's speed up this. So the other one here in this category of sort of effective attitude, emotion-based objections is like these phenomenological complaints, like, oh, it's not really conscious. It doesn't have like quality, So, people complain that, that's important to have quality. I'm suspicious of that, as I'll put a second later, but, that's the thing people worry about, or something like it. They're not calling it quality, but as a philosopher, it's basically, it doesn't have these intersubjective states, So, okay, so moving on here, normative objections. So these are more like ethical concerns. So primary concern is the erosion of things like patient autonomy, may make it difficult for patients to understand recommendations, may, complicate informed consent, limits their ability to make fully informed choices. Epistemic concerns around transparency are directly kind of tied to some of these normative concerns, like that people need a level of publicity or disclosure that's needed for informed consent, which is like this normative thing we think is really, really important in medicine. And so this sort of, undermine like individual autonomy, which is like another normative thing we care about, and, sort of like these broader things around like public reason. Anytime you have like publicity being compromised, it's and you have like this issue of opaqueness is gonna like compromise like public reason. In like any sort of like Rawlsian liberal sense of the term. So transparent education are essential to enable meaningful informed consent. And without these measures, patients may consent without fully understanding the implications, weakening the normative foundations of autonomy and informed decision making. Also accountability and liability. So who's responsible? So these are also normative issues. So like when AI misdiagnoses or causes failures, it's unclear who bears responsibility. Is it developers, the healthcare providers, and institutions using these technologies? So this sort of ambiguity complicates, accountability, which is sort of a fundamental principle in maintaining trust in healthcare systems. And the lack of clear liability frameworks may deter AI adoption due to fear of like legal repercussions. For instance, if the AI system incorrectly diagnoses the patient, it's unclear whether the responsibility, like I say, lies in the so. Also issues around privacy, so data breaches, unauthorized access. So you have like sort of privacy concerns, like the other normative considerations. All right, so again, for the sake of brevity, I'll skip on some of these. So the last sort of kind of objection before I get into my responses to these in the remaining time here is like sort of practical objections. So these just refer to like the feasibility of doing these things that, maybe like source, prohibitive, like source constraint. So like, there's a financial barrier that can exacerbate existing healthcare inequality. So privileging well-funded institutions is marginalized undeserved populations. While marginalizing undeserved populations, high cost of AI implementation can widen the gap between well-resourced and under-resourced healthcare facilities. Integration with existing healthcare workers is a technical and logistical challenge. So compatibility issues with like the electronic health records, interpretability standards can hinder the adoption of AI. So it's like essentially like a lot of issues around standardization of protocols. So like basically that's what I'm calling like broadly like actual pragmatic things about actually doing. So that's like one concern people have. Like, okay, in practice, like how do you actually like seamlessly integrate this technology? So for instance, for health, different hospitals may use varying electronic health care record system, making implementation of a universal AI solution difficult, and as a result, difficult to regulate, with like laws. So this variability poses an obstacle to widespread AI adoption. So not to scoff at these pragmatic concerns, like legitimate concerns, So the overall reliance on these sort of things can lead to sort of like skilling. That's like another issue. How do you deal with de-skilling that results from this? I'll talk about this later. It's unclear to me sometimes this is a worry all the time. Like people used to memorize a whole bunch of calculator facts, and now we use calculators. It's unclear to me that really matters there. So like it's not evident to me that just every type of de-skilling is bad, but it's a pragmatic concern, and some of them may be worrisome. And how do you do it? Okay. All right, so now I'm going to just go to some of my replies. Okay, now there's these objections. I'll start with number one. To mitigate these things, you could sort of do a lot of these tricks and traits I was just talking about. So one, you can make the data more representative, like different reweighting techniques, like I mentioned in the paper I got online, that can reduce like these types of biases. The point is like you can't be talking about bias in some vague sense. You have to be super clear about the type of bias you're complaining about. And when you have a clear type of bias, it's like we can come up with like mitigation strategies to correct for that type of bias. If we're talking about bias in this way I just described, where it's something that's actually influencing the data precisely. If you tell me how it's influencing the data, I could give you some epistemic thing to try to mitigate it. And whether or not we can eventually come up with some epistemic thing is just some empirical question, And if you think there's some hard methodological things, you have to give me a proof to show that, or prove it to me. So I'll give an example of so you may complain my standard is too stringent here, but I'll give you an example. So in fairness, it's well known result that different fairness definitions are incompatible. So that showed that no matter what you do, you can't mutually satisfy all these bias mitigation fairness definitions. That's a real limitation of a machine learning system. But the way you show that is not just vaguely talking about it. You have to actually demonstrate it. Otherwise, I have no evidence that what you're saying is correct. You're just talking. I need evidence that what you're saying is true. And sufficient evidence would be scientific evidence for me. So again, that may people be disagreeing about that, but fine, whatever. We can argue about that. But my claim is that those sort of objections I mentioned earlier about bias, data integrity, insofar as we know right now, there are strategies to mitigate them. Is no reason to think there won't eventually exist strategies to mitigate them. And if you think that there are not strategies to mitigate them, you have an obligation to provide for me a proof why you think this, or some argument for you to think that, okay? Okay, you can monitor and audit these systems. Again, these are all ways to sort of try to mitigate bias. So yeah, so these are sort of response to this data integrity reference class problem. Again, I don't think this is unique to AI. This is like a general problem with individual probabilities. That said, I have an algorithm. There are approaches to adjudicate this. I'm not going to go into detail because it's quite technical. If you want to know about it, you can read this paper, reconciling individual probabilities. Delusionist objection. Okay, now this might be a real thing about AI, but again, I'm even skeptical it is, because human thought processes are hard. I mean, okay, does that mean I can't make a decision in the court unless I can pop open somebody's brain and then you explain to me how a judge made a decision? Well, nobody thinks that's what is required for public reason for a decision to be justified. I have to give you a complete cognitive psychology explanation for how people make decisions, and we don't understand that. Why do I have to give a full explanation for how a model came up with a decision? Clearly, there is some level of like explainability required, but it's unclear to me that this actually isn't way more clear than a human, to be quite honest with you. Like I could actually explain to you what my objective function is. I can explain to you what the hyperparameters are. If I go to some human judge, he can't explain to me at all why he did something. And so again, I don't find this objection quite convincing at all, and I don't think it doesn't apply any more to some human. And to be quite honest with you, as a black man, I'd rather have a robot making decisions from a judge in Alabama. And so, yeah, it's not obvious to me. At least you can open up the algorithm and see what it's doing. I don't know. I do know what's going on that judge in Alabama. And so, yeah, so I'm not convinced by this. Also, there's lots of research in explainable AI. We're trying to make AI more explainable. There's lots of interesting technical results. This adaptability thing, again, I don't think this is unique to AI. If you read Kuhn or any of these people, the lack of humans are not adaptable. What about paradigms? I mean, let's just read Kuhn and how he changed scientific paradigms. Like, insofar as you're complaining about AI, to me, you're just gonna be complaining about like the stubbornness of humans to adopt anything or get out of like ideologies and embedded systems of thought. So again, that's not about the AI. I have a paper that's forthcoming that basically more or less makes this argument another way. I'm putting the pressure that there's nothing distinctive about AI at all for most of the cases people want to make. Most of them deflate to other issues around normativity that has very little to do about the specifics of the technology. Now, again, I'm not arguing this claim here, but just sort of, again, selling my own research. So, intuition, again, I talked about this intuition business. So remember that was, AI doesn't have intuition. Why should it? I mean, again, I don't want intuition actually a lot of times in medical practice. Again, I'm from Alabama. I went to Alabama State, which is not far from Tuskegee. And if you don't know anything about the Tuskegee experiment, that was full of all types of crazy intuition of what people think healthcare should be doing, and I don't want any of that in healthcare. So again, these intuition arguments, I'm not convinced by them. Again, whether or not AI can outperform humans, again, is an empirical claim. And what do we know empirically? 95% versus 87%. That's just a fact. That is just a fact. And clearly I'm more of an empirical person, but I could be that's just an empirical. Okay. Going on here again just for the sake of these effective attitudes now. Okay. Now this lack of empathy again. Now, depending on how you operationalize empathy, I just want to maybe say a little bit about this here because this is kind of problematic. If you want to operationalize empathy to be something that we can empirically measure, it can't be that you game the system to where like your notion of empathy is such that anything that is non-human can't happen. I mean, you could define it in that way, but then you're just kind of at the outset saying that only humans can be empathetic. That's not a very convincing argument to me. You just sort of tautologically stipulated that only things with phenomenological experiences like humans can have empathy. That's super specious. Why should I think that? Like, again, that's not a very convincing argument. So if you're going to try to operationalize empathy, and I'm not saying these studies that I'm going to point to do this properly, but it should be something that we can at least like other non-human, we can measure it, or we can think about how we should be measuring it. And when people do try to operationalize empathy, you know what they say? Well, let's just see what they say. Well, they evaluated a moral reasoning of large language models. They compared like advice given by Kwame Appiah, one of my favorite philosophers, versus some AI generated stuff. And you know what people prefer? They actually prefer the AI responses compared to Kwame Appiah. Now, if there's evidence that AI is a better, more reason than Kwame Appiah, I am a mere peon to Kwame Appiah. You never suggest such a thing, But I will say this, like, the more studies we see come out, it's not so obvious that, like, AI cannot respond in the right type of way to where a person feels like they're being attended to. Now, how is it important that this thing has actual qualia or intersubjective states? I mean, you might really value that. I don't. I just want to be treated the right way. Consumption Carmichael said, I don't care if a person believes I'm a Negro. I care if they treat me like I'm a Negro, basically. And so I care more about like how I'm actually treated by my healthcare institutions versus if you could be a philosophical zombie for all I care, as long as I'm getting the right type of health outcomes that I care that are appropriate. So like it's unclear to me if that's a matter thing. Also, there's other business about whether or not even doctors have the right type of empathy. Doctors consistently can score worse on empathy than nurse practitioners and PAs. So it's not even clear that your current healthcare provider is really even being empathetic with you. So again, like these criticisms, not unique to AI, they can be applied to other. I think they're problems. Here, I don't think this is anything to do with AI. I don't think it's special to AI. Okay, just going on here. This is just more evidence that AI can provide emotional support in a whole bunch of studies. The last one here, I'll go through. Addressing these normative things. Yeah, so these ethical considerations are on patient autonomy, accountability, data privacy. Basically my response here is that there's lots of mitigation strategies people are using for this. Again, I don't think it's an in principle hurdle. Basically, that's sort of, you can think of this argument. Like, I don't think these are in principle hurdles. So accountability and liability, accessibility of legal standards. People are attempting to do this. So, I mean, I currently work with the national security agents, like, like doing that's, like people trying to come up with form panels and, people try to form panels and, try to come up with laws. So it's not like you can't try to come up with the regulatory standards to figure out who should be responsible or who should be held liable for AI going awry. But it's not something that's in principle impossible, it doesn't seem like. So people are trying to come up with their guidelines. Some examples I just talked about, like the GPRA or like HIPAA, like some people are trying to come up with things like in compliance with those sort of regulations. So like things that people might do is like data minimization, atomization, differential privacy, which is something I work in. I do a lot of stuff in differential privacy, regular security audits. So there's sort of things that people are using here. I'll go to the last business here before I say my last thing and close. So the other one I talked about was like these sort of practical challenges. Again, I'm just going to say here, we can talk more about it in Q&A, but just for the sake of brevity, I think that these are logistical rather than like in principle barriers. So I don't think they're anything special to the AI. I think they're real logistical hurdles. In the paper, I kind of give some suggestions on how you might deal with some of them, but I don't try to stake a claim in these pragmatic ones because I leave that for creative policy decision makers and they can come up with other solutions. But now the last thing I'll talk about here is one very good reason for why I think you may think AI is a good thing to have integrated into healthcare. So healthcare is a fundamental basic, is a fundamental component of society's basic structure. So which is a central network of institutions that shapes individuals' access to goods, services, opportunities. So like healthcare, legal system, education, etc. And so when we're talking about these institutions, we're referring to core institutions that impact individuals' opportunity and outcomes. And, they form the framework in which we live our lives and interact with society. And for society to be just, its basic structures have to be organized in a way that guarantees fairness and access to those institutions. And so healthcare is a critical, one of these critical institutions, and anytime that sort of access is compromised, like during COVID, when it becomes overly burdened and individuals can't get access, like the very structure of, sort of justice in our society is really compromised. So, somebody suffering from a chronic illness without access to affordable healthcare, they can't work, they can't study, they can't inform, engage in community life, is severely restricted. And so, so the point I want to make here with this is that sort of the criticism, one of the big criticisms for why you might really be concerned with AI that was floating around in the background in a lot of these discussions, like individual risk. It's like, we're really concerned with like individual risks that can happen. And what I want to argue in this last little part is that, well, actually, I think we have good reason to think that efficiency, which allows us to have opportunity, accessibility, always, more often than not, outweighs individual risks. So I'm going to give a little example or whatever. So so efficiency is crucial for maintaining a just structure, particularly in healthcare, because an inefficient system can't meet the needs of all the citizens. So you have bottlenecks on waste time, limited access to resources. Inefficiency results in unequal access. So no healthcare system where it relies on humans or AI can be free of risk. The key question is not whether or not AI can eliminate risk, but whether or not the healthcare system can accept a certain level of risk by ensuring care to the greatest number of people, essentially. And so imagine a case to where if you think that no, we should be considering individual risk, consider a hospital assigning multiple surgeons to one operation to minimize risk. I mean, nobody would think that this is a reasonable thing to do because obviously, like, even though you may be reducing the chance of this person making a mistake because you put all these people in this room and other surgeons and they're consulting regularly, and like you may have some pathologists on call and some radiologists on call to look at the scans. Well, like now you're like creating a situation where like you decrease the overall access to care. Nobody would say that this was reasonable to do for the sake of increasing accuracy to prevent individual risk. Like clearly we think that like even though there's some chance of risk when we let one surgeon perform a procedure or whatever, or we don't have multiple people in there, it's okay because like there's this trade-off between some level of risk that we're willing to tolerate versus overall accessibility to an institution. And so basically my argument is that AI greatly increases your accessibility to an institution. In an institution where healthcare is already super unjust. And so like it makes very little sense to me not to be using healthcare in this way. Even in roles that were traditionally done by doctors, as I was saying earlier, they seem to do a lot better than doctors in some ways. And so what's the extent into you, I can't find a slide in here, but I have a slide in here. What's the extent to which inaccuracy can be allowed to the extent it doesn't undermine access to a basic structure, basically. So it's almost like a little Gaussian principle. What's the extent to which I can allow risk to the extent it does not compromise access to a basic institution? That's the principle to me. And so basically at the end, I'll just say some few principles like in which you can deploy healthcare. Like, so one, I think, the AI, excuse me. So one principle is like I think obviously you have to do the best you can to mitigate risk. You can't just say I'm not going to care about it at all. So you need to at least try to do it. So AI has to, and so the first principle is like it needs to like actually improve healthcare. Can be making it worse for people. Two, it needs to be ensuring like equitable access. So if you use the AI and it's actually like not, some people are not getting access to it and it's not justified to be used. This is like necessary conditions. Right? The third one is like it needs to be prioritizing well-being over profit or something like this. Again, I'm still working this out, still trying to figure out like a good way to frame this principle. But the idea I have here, just to kind of motivate, is like, okay, you can imagine I have this AI that increases like productivity by like twice as much. Like you can imagine I can do two things with that. I can either like fire half my employees, if I'm incentivized by just like maximizing payouts or something like this. Or, if I have some other objective function, like I don't know, like I'm like some worker democracy or something, I care about workers' well-being, I can just get people half the work here. So the point here is that obviously like whether or not AI is justifiable depends on like the incentive structure that is in a lot of times. So whether or not it's like justified deployed really does depend on like the making sure that it has the right type of incentives underwriting, because obviously I could deploy it in this simple toy example in a way to where I just like fire half the people or whatever. There's nothing about the AI itself there. It's really about, the AI just increases productivity, or any general technology is more so about like the broader incentive structure. So I think, we do want to work on the world in which AI is deployed and used in, but again, I don't think there's anything uniquely about AI. I don't think that's a limitation for not wanting to use AI. It could be a good reason to use AI. We need to work on our world, to make it a better place. So when we use AI, it can like make people like radiologists not working all the time. The radiologist can actually do poetry or something, so it needs to be improving patient care. And lastly, it needs to have, like I said, certain sufficient safeguards. So you can't just apply it with anything. Yeah, so that's that. Yeah, so in conclusion, basically I'm just going to talk basically what I've tried to do is just give a few criticisms for AI, try to get some objections for why I think those arguments aren't as strong as people take for granted. I try to motivate, like one of the main reasons why you will want to give AI is really has to do with this accessibility to like basic institutions idea I have, where it's like, I think the risk thing and individual risk around bias, like people just really play that up way too much. I actually think in lots of cases, like we don't really, like we're willing to tolerate that to the extent that it doesn't impede access to basic institutions like healthcare. And insofar as AI can greatly amplify that in the right conditions, is a reasonable thing to be doing, and using. And as I was saying kind of in passing, even with some of the jobs, it's not clear to me that some of those jobs should not be displaced. I'm not assuming that some jobs should be displaced. It's not clear to me that human calculators are a good thing, or we need those anymore. And so I think a lot of these arguments just require a lot more careful thought and evaluation.
Comments on that? And
Yeah, great, thank you. I wanted to start by thanking Joan and your colleagues at the Lincoln Center for putting this on. Thank you, Alex, for coming and sharing with us, and thank you to all of you for being here. I also want to say that my comments are based on a manuscript of Alex's talk. So if there are any discrepancies between the manuscript and what was said today, I will flag that for you. Okay. In his paper titled "Should AI Be Your Doctor?" Tolbert aims to first respond to 4 kinds of objections typically leveled against the use of artificial intelligence in clinical care, and second, to lay out conditions for the justified use of AI in clinical care. Regarding this first aim, Tolbert offers his reader a thorough yet easily accessible taxonomy of the kinds of objections leveled against the use of AI in healthcare. If nothing else, his presentation helps orient the reader to the current dialectic around healthcare and AI implementation. But as I will suggest, I believe that some of Tolbert's responses to these various objections require further clarification. And what follows, I will briefly restate the 4 kinds of objections presented by Tolbert, then invite him to further elaborate on his responses. Tolbert begins with what he refers to as epistemic objections. That is, objections based on, quoting from the manuscript, based on the limitations in AI systems' ability to generate accurate, reliable, and adaptive knowledge. For the sake of time and to avoid redundancy, I will not recapitulate each objection under this class of objections. Rather, I want to highlight that in response to several of the epistemic objections, Tolbert notes that the epistemic challenges present for AI are not unique to AI and are in fact present in human decision-making. For example, Tolbert states that both humans and AI systems face data integrity issues, such as underrepresentation and a lack of representative data. Both humans and AI systems face difficulties when making individualized probability predictions. Both human decision-making and the interpretability of AI systems face issues of opaqueness, and both humans and AI systems may suffer from an inability to adapt to the ever-changing medical landscape. While these observations are noteworthy, I worry that Tolbert's response does little to garner confidence in the use of AI. If the point of implementing AI in a healthcare context is to rectify the shortcomings present without its implementation, that it is unable to do so, at least as it relates to the epistemic shortcomings of humans. And I do not know why healthcare institutions would want to complicate an already imperfect system. This complication is further underscored by the other three kinds of objections to be discussed shortly. Now, to be fair to Tolbert, he does offer two examples of how AI might improve our epistemic predicament. First, Tolbert suggests that with the proper safeguards and advancements in transparency, AI may be less vulnerable to ingrained biases and ideological rigidity that humans have. Second, Tolbert suggests that advancements in explainable AI are improving the transparency and interpretability of AI systems. But it isn't clear to me the extent to which AI can overcome these epistemic hurdles, apart from its programmers and developers also overcoming these hurdles. For example, I was and I still am under the impression that much of the literature on algorithmic bias is the result of AI's inability to shed the prejudices or oversights of its developers, be that in programming errors or the data that the AI is trained on. And so my first question for you, Alex, is can you say more about how, if at all, AI might correct for the biases and ideological rigidity present in its developers, apart from its developers first making the corrections themselves? Moving now to what Tolbert refers to as the phenomenological objections, that is, objections regarding AI's inability to provide the qualitative aspects of healthcare delivery that involve empathy, emotional support, and the human touch. Let me start by saying I am sympathetic to the idea that AI could free up time for healthcare workers to exercise more empathy and emotional connection with their patients. This comes from the manuscript. But as I will suggest later, this seems at best to suggest that AI is a useful administrative assistant or assistive tool more generally. Additionally, while Tolbert does cite examples of promising effective computing, this also comes from a paper, for example, Robot or WISA, it is worth noting that these examples are chatbots. Yet, depending on what study you look at, 70 to 93% of communication is nonverbal, with an estimated 55% coming from body language, gestures, facial expressions, eye contact, head nodding, and the like. This nonverbal communication is particularly important when expressing empathy. And while I will grant that AI systems can engage in certain forms of nonverbal communication, for example, in the paper, Alex talks about how it can kind of match tone of voice. And while I will also grant that individuals communicating with chatbots via messaging software can find satisfaction given the constrained limitations of expectation when using such software, I find it hard to understand how this will work with, say, bedside clinical care. Can AI systems be anything more than an assistive tool here? The unspoken expectations and nonverbal communication needed to express empathy, or use whatever word you want, but for example, holding the hand of a hospice patient, hugging a family member dealing with the loss of a loved one, laying hands on a patient to pray for them, on its face suggests the need for human-to-human interaction. Philosopher and physician Edmund Pellegrino wrote, "Medicine is the most humane of the sciences." I believe that is largely due to the intimate human-to-human connection medicine has historically relied on. I wonder if it can continue as such if AI is anything over and above an assistive tool. So this leads to my second question. do you think that AI at some point will be able to successfully exhibit the nonverbal features of communication necessary to express empathy, or if you think it's too biased to refer to that as empathy, but express the phenomena that I've described? And if so, what would it look like? Or do you think that human touch will always be necessary for good clinical care? And if so, what does this mean for the role of AI as a doctor? Colbert discusses what he refers to as normative objections. That is, and I quote again, normative or ethical considerations surrounding the deployment of AI in healthcare. Alex highlights the 4 principles of biomedical ethics traditionally appealed to, as beneficence, non-maleficence, respect for autonomy and justice, as well as considerations derived from these principles. For example, privacy and data security, accountability and liability, and informed consent. I believe that all of this is important in our moral deliberation about implementing AI in clinical care. One concern, however, that I have is what I will refer to as moral deskilling. Tolbert discusses the issue of deskilling, but I think what he is referring to, and I'd like some clarification, is a sort of technical deskilling in which healthcare workers' technical skills erode due to an over-reliance or deference to AI. But there's another form of moral deskilling in which healthcare workers become too dependent on AI for moral deliberation, such that they no longer cultivate the virtues necessary for good medicine. Cultivating virtue requires, amongst other things, habituation through practice, reflection on personal experience, engagement with virtuous exemplars, and dialogue that increases virtue literacy. And while the implementation of AI is not mutually exclusive to these practices, under extreme forms of deference and mechanical adherence, reliance on AI can work against these practices and ultimately against the cultivation of virtues necessary for good medicine. Now, I think that this is far more important than the person that loses the ability to be a human calculator, as I think that the technical skill of being a human calculator could probably flourish without it, but I find it difficult to see how one might flourish if there is some sort of moral skilling or some kind of mitigation in cultivating certain virtues. So my third question is, I didn't really say much about this, but I believe, and I can talk about this some more, history is replete with examples of decision procedures being abused or mitigating practical reasoning when they're applied mechanically. And so I wonder how we might use AI in our moral deliberation so that we don't risk this sort of moral deskilling that I'm thinking about. All right. As the final class of objections, Tolbert presents what he refers to as practical objections. That is, objections regarding the feasibility, implementation challenges, and economic implications of integrating AI into healthcare systems. I agree with Tolbert that the practical issues presented are not fundamental barriers to AI implementation. What's more, I appreciate Tolbert's modesty and transparency and the attentiveness of his proposed solution. So he wasn't able to present it here, but in the paper he offers some possible solution and acknowledges, though, that it's still a matter of empirical inquiry to see if the solution would work. And so this is not much of a challenge, more than it is an invitation for discussion. But while the practical challenges presented are not fundamental barriers to AI, do you think they need to be resolved prior to implementing AI? Why or why not? And given healthcare's finite resources, how might investing in the remedy of these practical issues impact other sectors of healthcare? All right, so much for the various kinds of objections. I now want to discuss the conditions Tolbert offers for the justified use of AI as a primary healthcare provider. 5 conditions are as follows, and I'm reading from his paper. He was able to present them, but I know he didn't have enough time to elaborate on them. AI must significantly improve healthcare efficiencies. AI must ensure equitable access to healthcare services. Incentives must prioritize healthcare workers and patients' well-being over profit. AI must lead to tangible improvements in patient care quality and accessibility. And the final one is AI systems must include reasonable safeguards against bias and privacy issues without compromising the accessibility and efficiency of the healthcare system. Now, time will not permit me to go into detail for each condition, so I'm just going to ask you 2 questions. First, are these conditions necessary and sufficient for the justified use of AI as a primary care physician? If you think they're necessary, what makes them necessary? If you think they're sufficient, what makes them sufficient? I am inclined to grant to you that they are all necessary. but I am skeptical of there being sufficient. For example, insofar as AI causes or is associated with moral and other certain forms of technical de-skilling, I would think that its use as a primary care physician is unjustified. And I think related to this question is the question, what sort of justification you are referring to? Do you mean ethically justified, politically or legally justified, epistemically justified, prudentially justified, maybe some combination of these? Because I think that however you answer the second question, what sort of justification you're looking for, is going to dictate how you answer my first question, namely why you think they're necessary or sufficient, right? Overall, I read your conditions and your responses to the objections as at best supporting the use of AI in clinical care as an assistive tool. I'm kind of curious if that's also what you see it being, just an assistive tool. And I also want to be clear as I close that I am not advocating for the eschewal of or wholesale resistance to implementing AI in healthcare. I think that wholesale rejection of AI in healthcare settings is neither prudent nor feasible. It's not a matter of if we should implement AI, it's how we should use AI. And I think that critical evaluation of the risks and benefits and conversations like these can help us decide how we shape AI and how we allow AI to shape us. Thanks.
No, thanks. Thank you for being, thank you for taking time to read my paper so carefully, very helpful in comments that I think will make the draft a lot stronger. So first, I mean, you might want to keep that open. You can, go through some of these questions again. So the first one I believe was around like the bias, right? Like it was almost like a turtles all the way down objection. We're just like, if the AI, again, can you repeat it? Because I want to know.
Yeah, can you say more about how, if at all, AI might correct for the biases and ideological rigidity present in its developers, apart from its developers making the corrections themselves? So my thought was like, look, and you've even said this, like when you find a bias, you try to come up with some sort of algorithm or some model that can correct for it. That requires you, our team, to make that correction, right? And, I'm thinking that if both AI and us have some kind of short-sightedness, is there anything that AI can do to make the correction apart from us? Making the corrections within itself? Because if not, it just seems like, maybe AI shares its problem. And that just makes me think, why do I want AI? I can have this problem all by myself.
Yeah, so let me know as an idea. So the idea is like, you can't come up with a bias, you can't identify the need, AI can't self-identify the need for a bias mitigation technique or something like this.
Or self-correct.
AI lacks the capacity to self-correct. That's not true with some algorithms. So some algorithms, like, like you can have like it, now again, it's like no guarantee that it will do this, but like some algorithms do have an ability to make, like loop through and check or whatever. But the more basic point is like, what do you think about like this requirement that, in order for you to identify a problem, you have to have like a human in the background. I mean, I have no problem with that. I don't think this threats my thesis because I think one bit of clarification here that helps with a lot of these is, again, I have a provocatory title just for the sake of it, but like if you could be clear, what I was really arguing and what I was really doing dialectically saying, what are the objections people give for why they think AI should not be playing a role in healthcare? And what I rhetorically was doing was showing those objections do not distinctively or uniquely apply to AI. They apply more broadly to human decision makers in a wide variety of different spaces. And so at that point, it becomes other values or other things we might have to use to determine if or if not we should be using the AI. And what I was using as evidence, or I use as evidence sometimes, like, okay, well, one thing clearly would be an empirical evaluation. Is it in fact more accurate at doing this thing than a regular human decision maker would? I mean, again, that's just some empirical claim. And you just like, you look out in the world and you see. And if it does do it, then that's a reason, it's not the only reason, but that may be a +1 reason to use it. Right. And for many of these cases too, like the wanted to use AI in decision making, that is precisely one of the motivations people wanted to use it. It's like, oh, well, humans have all types of arbitrary implicit biases, and we can't really explicitly check for them in the way that you can. I can look and see what the objective function in an AI algorithm is for some of them. Other more complicated models, this may not be the case. But we even have to be clear there, because like I can see what the objective function is in a neural network. It's just cross entropy. That's like very simple. I can see what it's doing, and I can throw whatever other objective functions to constrain the model I would like. I can't do that with a human decision maker unless I impose laws maybe to say don't do this or something. So yes, so that's the first point. Like I agree, or I acknowledge that. One, some AI does have the ability to like self-correct. Number two, AI or any sort of inductive technology for that matter, whether it be a basic regression model, is not going to self-correct on its own. It needs like human, to sort of lurking in the background somewhere, or unless we're talking about AI in the sense of we have an actual, conscious, when we weren't talking about AI like that, we're talking about AI like statistical models, highly sophisticated probabilistic models. That's what we were talking about, not like some sentient thing, whatever. Yeah, so what was the second
Yeah,
question?
good. So let me say that as it relates to these questions, really what is coming up for me is, again, not so much if we should use it, but how we should use it. I'm trying to figure out where the limitations are. And for all of my questions, I think what I'm pushing for is it seems at best to be an assistive tool.
Okay.
Now, I know you were using a provocative title
Yeah.
about it as like primary care physician.
Yeah.
I don't think you thought like some robot was gonna come up
Yeah.
and serve at the bedside, but I'm trying to press you, I wanna hear what you think.
Okay, I gotta say more about that. Now, I will say I am way more, I do, it's not obvious to me that like within the next, again, just take for instance that you really see all these automated cars driving around here, and I will guarantee y'all will not be long before they all over United States. And just when the time I started my graduate program, in what was it, 2020, 2019, like these large language models, it's literally following Moore's law right now. I'm not even joking. I'm not using hyperbole. Like this AI technology is following Moore's law, and so it's not obvious to me that like AI will not have the capacity to have like significant reasoning capacity, where I mean reasoning like very sophisticated pattern recognition that uses causal reasoning in a way that surpasses a person. Now, whether or not that is like has awareness or anything like that, I mean, I'm agnostic about that. I don't know. But what I can tell you is this: it will be able to reason in a way that's highly sophisticated probabilistically and do the type of transfer learning I was talking about. And if it can do that, it can make diagnoses. And if it can do that, it can imitate human behavior, And if it can imitate human behavior, like I said, I already gave the example in the paper for voice stuff, especially depending on how more sophisticated, computer visual technology is, it's not obvious to me that it won't be able to pick up on, certain sorts of like expressive attitudes that make valid inferences from this. Again, like, will we get to a point of that? Again, if it continues on the trajectory it is right now, which it may hold. I mean, I don't have good reason to think that it currently is. I think we're in the very baby stages right now. I actually think that AI could be diagnosing people like better. Like if we start doing empirical studies, again, they have studies like how I looked at the one with comparing nurse practitioners and making sort of primary care diagnosis compared to MDs. They do basically as well, because it's like these sort of like, family settings or internal medicine settings. I mean, I would like to see a study if people started coming in, like you could do like a basic trial, like, oh, you're coming to the doctor for a headache, some basic stuff. How well does the AI do? If it reaches that, I would have no problem with it. Again, this is an empirical claim to me. I don't think it's in principle thing,
Yeah, good. So I mean, I think that ties into the next two questions though. I actually am not opposed to that. Actually, you're right, that it will be able to successfully diagnose better than human skin. But the other two questions, and then I should probably stop to that. To the real questions, is do you think that it will become sophisticated enough to offer some of the nonverbal communication
Right.
that I mentioned? And then also the concern about moral de-skilling.
Yeah, I really like that argument, right. No, I really like that. I mean, that was something I actually hadn't considered when I wrote the paper, and I really like that. Cause I was thinking about like the technical de-skilling, but that's a really interesting point about like the moral de-skilling, you know, like, again, you know, my gut inclination is I actually think this already happens when people get pushed through the current medical school system. Just with my friends I know who go through residency, they actually become more apathetic to people and patients the longer they become a doctor. And actually, I mean, you know, versus some bushy, bright-eyed, you know, doctor or nurse, you know, I mean, I think with nurses, the burnout rate is like 5 years, you know, and so, you know, will the AI help? Will it contribute to that? I mean, certainly it could. You know, I think one thing people are doing right now in some of these studies I talked about, the obvious thing is actually trying to use AI to help people understand moral reasoning. So like that study, what they did was they not only they basically gave people these prompts, like they asked them questions that were in the response that was in the ethicist, and they blinded them if it was Appia or a thing, and so again they didn't without being prejudiced or speeches. They thought, oh, I like this was better. And what they did was they also had to give an explanation for how it came up. Like they had to give a moral explanation. Like, what was your explanation for this? Now, I mean, that could be quite assistive, you know, to people. Like, you know, can you use it like, hey, like we have this patient, you know, like maybe some bioethical case, like, hey, we have this patient, this. Can you tell us like some considerations and give us reasoning? I mean, in that case, it's a more of an assistive thing, you know, like, you know, it can help the person maybe understand different normative reasons. But if you're just completely like, you know, like off-putting like the normative duty of like all decision making to the AI, then yes, like you know, I mean, you would probably have to do some more creative things like, you know, like regular in services or something like this, you know, yeah, you know, I think I give some examples like this in the pragmatic, you know, like I would think it'd be similar to some of the technical de-skilling. Basically, you have to like regularly make sure that people, like when I was a teacher, you got to do a certain number of in services. You need to, you know, do a certain number of like hours to make sure that you stay on top of whatever, you know, which would include like a regular normative course. That would include a course on how to use AI and different sort of norms. So basically, I think just regular in-servicing people and making sure that people stay on top of certain like hours and say maybe even certified or something, I don't know, you know, it's spitballing. But like I would think maybe something like that could, again, I don't think it's an in-principle thing. I think, you know, creative policy and decision makers could probably come up with ways to make sure that people aren't, you know, losing their moral edge in the clinical setting or whatever, you know.
Oh, we're gonna have questions.
I'm sorry, I just want to say, because practically speaking, I'm from a law background. It has been in the news the last months where United Healthcare was being accused of healthcare fraud by the Inspector General, you know, the federal government for False Claims Act, because United Healthcare was routinely denying every single one implants that a lot of people switched insurance for. And so what the government did was they empirically pulled the file, not examined people, but pulled the file and found that in each case, it's, in their opinion anyway, that's the Inspector General, it should have been granted, they're denied. So you have the legal system is up there. That's an important component in the real life cases that are happening right now, particularly with United Healthcare. So what they did, they had to a lot of people appealed and they had to cover it. But I'm just saying that there are empirical studies being doing now between the level in healthcare between the patient, then you have the doctor, and then you have the insurance company, and then you have the government oversight. So it's a really interesting quad thing going on right now and in the news, you know, that's the last month.
Yeah, okay, good. As we all know, it's sometimes hard to get in to see a general practitioner and hard to find one that's taking new patients. And so a couple years ago, a Chinese researcher team had developed a diagnostic tool with an avatar or chatbot. And it was doing, I mean, it was getting like high 90s and accurate diagnoses as a GP, and it used the natural language processing, and the people loved it and they felt really listened to.
Yeah.
Yeah, and so they were diagnosing better than normal GPs even. It was incredible. And yeah, it was pretty incredible. The other thing is they did a study where they had chatbots respond to patients' questions to doctors, and then doctors respond, and they found that chatbots were rated as more empathetic. We're going to use it to train new doctors to be empathetic based on the chatbots' responses. I thought that was funny.
Yeah.
And the last thing is they were, you know, those minute clinics?
Yeah.
There was a local entrepreneur here that was going to hire space in all those minute clinics and use AI diagnostics, but have the person go into a booth, put the stethoscope, you know, show where the stethoscope should be, take all their diagnostics, and then do an online, you know, after they have ruled out certain things, then and only then would the doctor come on and have a discussion.
Right, right.
It improves access.
No, I mean, and that's more or less, I mean, you see that's done right now, even when, you know, hey, I go to the doctor is like the very last person to come in after, you know, I've talked to the NP, after I've talked to the RN, and the doctor's literally in there for like 5 seconds, just for some bureaucratic reason that they have to come in there and say, okay, I agree with everything the NP said, I'm out, you know? And so, yeah, I mean, I agree. I mean, I recently went to the doctor last week. I just needed, like some basic allergy medicine. And of course, like trying to even just get in was like super annoying. And I was like, this is like, you literally already know what the problem is. I could have typed it in the ChatGPT what it was. Sure enough, I went, this is a complete waste of my time. After I was finally get in there, I was like, oh, you know, and of course my $30 copay, on top of this, you know, and so, I mean, to my point, the normative point, I was like, oh, like, for me, I think, it allows for accessibility in the system that's already messed up. Of course, I'm not, like I acknowledge, there will be issues, like, but again, I don't think this is an issue to AI of like, anytime you have this type of technology, people may lose jobs. And you have to really think carefully about what we're gonna do in situations to where it makes no sense to have a biller anymore or a person doing that, when it actually makes more sense to have something automating that task. But again, this has not been new. MIT had a department of propeller design prior to World War II, you know, and when the creation of propulsion jet engines, that department became from, you know, and, you know, this has been the case with many technological innovations, and, you know, we have to figure out how to make sure that these people, you know, are sustained. You know, again, I'm hesitant to say anything definitive about that. If it's some UBI or whatever, again, these are different types of questions that are above my pay grade. You know, I'm more so interested in like, if this is an in principle hurdle for AI and what sort of benefit does AI bring, which to me is primarily this accessibility business.
Okay, thanks. That was very interesting. I want to press you on the phenomenological objection.
Okay.
So one of the things you said was, you know, what I care about is how I'm treated. I don't care about the quality. I wonder how much that's true. I mean, I at least want to be respected, and that's an attitude that no AI could have towards me. So like, for instance, I imagine that a lot of Black people want to be respected too when they go to the doctor, and they don't. I mean, there's a history of doctors not listening to Black people as far as their pain goes, their statements of how much pain they're in, and under medicating them. They don't tend to believe Black people when they say that they're in this much pain. That seems disrespectful, and I think that matters. You could replace, you know, the doctors. You know, you might say, well, look, this is why we need AI. We have an AI come in, right, and not a racist doctor, but an AI who looks at the objective criteria and determines how likely the person is to be in pain. But I think we also want to be listened to. We want to be respected. So, and we want to be believed.
Yeah.
And so I don't know that, I mean, it might be an AI deciding is better than a racist doctor deciding. But I don't, or, you know, a racist judge deciding about recidivism. But I think the best thing is we actually have another human being who respects us, listens to what we're saying, and makes a judgment on the basis of what we're saying and their respect for us.
Yeah, I think it probably is gonna heavily can depend on how you cash out respect and standing in proper relationship. So, I mean, yeah, I kind of have this sort of outcomes-based view that I was tacitly kind of pushing. We're like, oh, me being relationally and equal in society is me just having a certain distribution of things, you know. Now, I'm not going to say it's capabilities or whatever. For me, I'm more of a Rawlsian, so I want a certain distribution of basic resources. And I don't care if this thing has an inner life, if it's giving me the type of resources that I need to be a free and equal person and have the right type of moral powers in that society to live how I want to live as a free individual. You know, if this thing really didn't believe me, you know, it just probabilistically, you know, predicted that this is what my concern is and knew that people with my facial tone and heart, you know, say even can see my heart beating and all that stuff, I should respond to it him like this. I don't think that idiosyncratic. I mean, I could point to you lots of people in the Black tradition. I just pointed like Kwame Ture. Like that actually was his view. And it was like lots of people in Black political philosophy who actually think that. You know, I mean, of course, Garcia and others who really care about effective attitudes and do think respect and regard have to do with that. But I mean, that's a very specific view of morality that I don't have to take, you know, and it's legitimate to have a different view about it, you know. But I do understand why those who do take that sort of view may could be, you know, worried about it. So I do acknowledge that, you know. But I will say that if Black, if one is concerned about maybe certain types of like outcome-based view of relational equality, or you know, that's how you cash out like what it means to be respected, is to be in certain types of resources that put me in front. That's what it means to be in the right type of relationship. I don't think, you know, the inner states, whether or not they actually have. And just to say this, there's no way for me to actually test or empirically evaluate, even if a person has those. You know, they can be a very good mimicker. A lot of people philosophy stuff is like, you know, fake white, you know, sympathizers. You know, Martin Luther King talked a lot about this. You know, and how do you ultimately distinguish these people? Ultimately, I mean, it's what they do. I mean, like what people are ultimately going to say at the end of the day, I'm going to evaluate it by like what they actually did, the outcomes, how they treated, you know, whether or not they actually had a deep sense of regard. It's not like it's a little wand I can wave and see if this person really had respect for me. You know, they could be a very clever mimicker, you know.
So Tom, one more question before ending it. Yes.
So I think I'm pretty sympathetic to the idea that a lot of the objections, all of them, are non-unique to the problem of AI because it represents general problems with the. One thing I'm wondering though is whether what makes some of the, in particular the normative concerns, so troubling is how systemic they are. And one thing that I'm curious about AI for systemic normative harms, just because you have the potential for a monopoly or a small number of sort of AIs being where you would normally have thousands of practitioners and heterogeneity for different practice practitioners. And it's less easy to control all of those practitioners than a single or a couple AI algorithms.
Oh, interesting. I see. Yeah, so I
Power and control element.
right, that's an interesting point there. So right, so you know, yeah, so the idea would be like, well, look, you know, it's a lot harder to go around you know, yeah, like there's multiple positions you have to check, but like if it's an AI, it would be like just maybe like some, oh, like we all use, I don't know, chat GPT, like some, I don't know, out the box language model in this healthcare setting, and some company sells it and everybody more or less uses it. So it's like really poor. Now everybody's using this thing that's like really bad or whatever. Whereas it's like if I had a doctor, he was like a bad doctor, but then like, you know, I sort of like, you know, like standardize this guy And like, now everybody's relying on my really bad doctor to provide them medical services, my really bad doctor that I go to is just, I kind of have to deal with them, and because I'm in Mobile, I live like I live in a rural town, so I just gotta deal with this guy. But I would hate for this guy to have to be commercialized in some way, and now everybody's using him. That's an interesting point, again, I don't know if that, I don't know if that's about AI, though, like, I think that's maybe about like commercialization of technology broadly, or kind of like that. When you bring them to scale, there's some level of like standardization of the technology, and so, if it's a faulty Tesla, everybody's gonna get the, like that model of Tesla, it's not, like, I don't know if that's, I think that's a real thing, and insofar as that's true for other types of, like I just talked about like cars and other things like that, like it certainly would be true of this type of technology. Now how do you mitigate that or deal with that? Now, one thing would be to think about, again, I don't think it's about the AI, it's addressing deeper societal issues. You might just have concerns about like the power that technocratic regimes have in the US. Like, that's a real thing. They kind of like, do what they want to do, more or less. They sort of like use these sort of engagement algorithms, like more or less to how they like. It creates all types of moral polarization, all types of things that we think are bad or whatever. And, they even control privacy to some degree. It's not like, if we make trade-offs between privacy and public safety, if we do it as a matter of like some morality and types of like public reason, like we came together and we decided that this is the type of trade-off we want to make between privacy and public reason, we tend to think maybe that's sort of justified if it was generally determined deliberatively in this way. But if it's like some just technocratic regime that handed down, and this is how, how I'm making this decision, we tend to think those things are unjustified. And the solution I would say to that is like, don't have technocratic corporate, like maybe you should like not do that. Like, but again, I think that's more like trying to make society more liberal. Like, again, like I'm a Rawlsian, so I'm just like, you should try to do the type of things that Rawls is concerned with, and try to make society like an actual more liberal democracy to where you don't have this type of stuff. And that was one of the conditions I talked about. Like, insofar as society reflects more of a proper liberal democracy, then it makes sense to be using technology. But insofar as society is very non-ideal, and people are doing like crazy things, and people are over here like creating like super PACs and being like the technocratic regimes are like funding, like lobbyists and kind of writing laws and keep them from being like held accountable. That's not a liberal society. Like, that's like, at least we're getting far away from like the, I don't know about what Charles Mills say, it's like the basic institutions are messed up, but it's certainly fairly illiberal. It's getting there. So like, but again, that's nothing to do with AI. It's society, so yeah, that's kind of my thoughts.